All right, so we're going to talk about two different lift principles, Newton's third law and Bernoulli's principle. Typically, when most people talk about lift, when we're working in aircraft and drones and people are trying to talk about what lift is, very often they don't get too deep into the two principles that explain lift. We just call it lift. There's lift because it's lift. And honestly, there's not really a consensus amongst the scientific community as to what causes lift. So it's kind of split between Newton's third law and Bernoulli's principle. So we're going to talk about both of those. Both of those will be found on the test. That mostly just that you know they exist. I think the questions are somewhere along the lines of, what are the two laws or principles of lift, and it's Newton laws and Bernoulli's principle. So let's pop over to Newton's law. So I want you to see here Newton's law, how Newton laws work. Newton law refers to, we've heard it before, if every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And that's the principle behind Newton's third law when it refers to lift. So I like to look here at this center illustration when it talks about the wing in its angle of attack, its perspective or angle of attack. So if you take a look here at this aircraft, this aircraft has a pretty flat angle of attack. So in its flat angle of attack, it's going to have less equal and opposite reaction or less lift. So as we adjust that angle of action, and I get it, you're like, what the heck are you talking about? Work with me. Let's see if I can get there. We have a flat angle of attack. So the flat angle of attack in Newton's law talks about the thrust from the engines that are both pushing forward and drawing back. So it's creating this airflow that's coming over the aircraft, okay? And at a flat angle of attack, that has the least amount of lift. So I want to increase the angle of attack, so hopefully I can better illustrate how the principle, the Newton's third law, is explained or as a theory for lift. So with the plane back and the air being pushed and pulled over the wings, more air is deflected as that angle of attack increases on the bottom. So therefore, the reaction on the top of the wing is this lift. Okay, so your action is air being deflected. That's a downward. And so now this aircraft has lift. Okay, did y'all see that? Deflection, down, and the opposite reaction is lift. And so you see that in the first illustration. Here in the first illustration, as we have airflow, angle of attack, and then finally you see as the angle of attack is greater, we have a greater amount of air being deflected downward, which the opposite reaction is upward. So the wing flies up. That's Newton's third law. All right? The other principle that is considered is Bernoulli's principle. Bernoulli's principle talks about, it's really the same movement, because we know that the wing moves both at a flat or a low angle of attack, and then can be adjusted higher for higher angle of attack. So it's still this airflow, this stream of air that moves over the airfoil, and you can see it here in these two lines, moving over the airfoil, and the low stream on the bottom side is a high pressure, low velocity with a shorter distance to travel. But because the aircraft has this airfoil shape, this teardrop shape on the top, this air then gets deflected up, around and has to create a longer distance. And because it has a longer distance, it's low pressure, high velocity, and it loses pressure above the wing. So that goes back to this little 3D model, that's backwards, that I printed. As that airflow is coming to the wing, and again, our angle of attack is high, our angle of attack is flat. So that changes how fast the air travels beneath, and then how much is obstructed and slowed down on the top. With the Bernoulli's principle, the more of the angle of attack that we add, the less dense it becomes here on the top of the wing. So that principle is the high pressure, low velocity, because it has to go a shorter distance with less resistance, compared to the low pressure, high velocity of the wind going over the top of the airfoil, which becomes less dense, and objects have a tendency to move from a higher pressure to a lower pressure. And that's how Bernoulli's principle explains lift. So we'll pop back one more time to Newton's law and review that one more time, that with Newton's law and the increase of attack, the increase of the wing angle creates more downward deflection. And Newton's law says if we have a downward deflection, we should have an opposite reaction on top, which means the wing moves forward or up. I shouldn't say forward. It moves up. It's moving forward for another reason, right? Okay. And then finally, one more quick review of Bernoulli's principle. Bernoulli's principle talks about a low airstream, low velocity, high pressure, a shorter distance to pass the wing, in contrast to the air that has to brake at the front of the wing, take the longer distance, which creates a low pressure, high velocity, creating an upward lift of the wing. So you kind of got an idea what the two are. They're debated in the science community. I feel like I see a lot more people leaning towards the Bernoulli's principle. There's a lot more diagrams in the FAA that specifically references the Bernoulli principle. For the test, it's not asking you which one is right. It's asking you to recognize that there's more than one principle of lift, and to know that they're Newton's third law and Bernoulli's principle. If you've got those two things down and a general understanding of how lift works on either one of those two principles, you'll do just fine under this category.